Concordia is really pleased to launch Eastchester's 350th anniversary celebration. You know, after all, Concordia has been part of this community for over 130 of those 350 years. As we gather here today on this snowy afternoon to hear a bit about the immigrant story, you should know that the college was really founded by German immigrants. And Concordia's mission to nurture students of all faiths in a Christian, Christ-centered, value-oriented, liberal arts education for lives of service to church and community is in a way similar to the covenant of Eastchester's 1665 covenant, which included commitments to plainly deal with each other in Christian love and to provide for the education of children. Concordia is delighted and honored to keep the covenant with our Eastchester community, a community that has so richly blessed the college with thoughtful friendship and generous support over all these years. Let me take this opportunity also to introduce a dear friend of the college and a personal friend and traveling companion, Patty Dornwood. You know, Bob is sitting all the way in the back, and you can make up your own stories about why somebody sent him all the way to the last bench. But Patty is chair of the One Book, One Community Read program and a member of Eastchester's 350th steering committee and really a loyal friend and neighbor for so many years of the college. Patty.
Thank you. Whoops. Thank you, Vijay, and a very warm welcome to all of you, and a congratulations for getting here and parking and getting yourself situated on a very cold winter day where there's even snow in the air. And I just really want to, once again, on behalf of everybody here, thank Dr. Vijay George and the Concordia College family for the great hospitality that they are showing to us today, and they will continue to throughout this big 350th anniversary year. And I hope you won't mind if I just take a second or two to introduce to you those volunteers from our community who are here, who have been working for literally 2 years toward this date, even more than 2 years. Because as you can see from the brochure you were handed as you came in, or maybe you received in the mail prior to this date, there has been a lot of planning going on, and there are going to be a lot of really fun and interesting and informative programs. So without any further ado, let me introduce the members of the steering committee. And I'm going to ask them to stand and to hold your applause till the last person is introduced. And then I want you to applaud not only them, but their spouses who have given so much time to allow them to come to all the meetings. So we have 2 co-chairs. One, Bob Briggs, is not here today. He's on a family vacation. But very importantly, his co-chair is Linda Laird, our town clerk, who is right over here. And I'm going to read the other names in alphabetical order. Town Councilman Joe Dooley, Michael Fix, former president of the Eastchester Historical Society, Anne Marie Flannery, president of the Eastchester Historical Society, Richard Forliano, our town historian, our county legislator, Sheila Marcotte, and a former president of the Eastchester Historical Society. She's sitting with Bob, okay. And Eloise Morgan, our Bronxville Village historian. Les Vaccaro, I'm not sure if he made it yet, our former town councilman. I don't believe I saw Nancy Vittorini either, former co-chair of the Bronxville Historical Conservancy. Dr. Robert Wine, who's the former co-chair of the Bronxville Historical Conservancy. And Phil White, not to be last, who is our former mayor of the village of Tuckahoe and a very wonderful member of our committee as he chairs Tuckahoe's History Committee. So I hope he will come. Now, it's time to applaud all of these great volunteers. Behind every larger group, there are so many people who do work. And I don't want to not mention, some of the people, but there are a few that need to be singled out right now because they have been either working with us for over a year and will continue to, or they have worked hard even all through the summer months to bring us this far. First and foremost, our treasurer, Deborah Jemborowski, our web designer and webmaster, Jennifer Frost, and her husband, Kevin Elbert, and Donato Vaccaro, who's been an integral part of the website committee and is here today, and Don and Diane Blauweiss, who designed our brochure and helped us with its printing. I also want, yes, let's applaud them. I think it's also very good to mention the wonderful support we've gotten from our history lovers, the Eastchester Historical Society, the Bronxville Historical Conservancy, the Tuckahoe History Committee, and the Westchester County Historical Society. And not to be left out, we have to credit all those wonderful places where we're going for research. St. Paul's Church National Historic Site in Mount Vernon, the Westchester County Archives, and the New York State Archives. So all of these history groups have been supportive of our town's efforts to celebrate, and we're very grateful to them. Plus, we are very appreciative of how many of you found out about today's program, which is through all the local service organizations and groups that you belong to, and who have notified you through their email lists of this kickoff. For this particular program that focuses, as Dr. George said, on one book, one community reading, we have been working with the 3 library directors of Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. It was the idea of a former interim library director in Bronxville, Linda Smith-Scherer, that wouldn't it be great if the 3 communities joined together to read the same book? Well, you try to pick out a title, and it wasn't easy. We went through a lot of suggestions, and then we concluded that our immigrant experience is a common one, a common, unique, and enriching one that we need to focus on through the year. The legacy that we have from those who came from so far away and continue to come and enrich our community is special. To that end, the 3 library directors have been working on this program. We've been augmented by John Mariani, a noted food authority and restaurant critic in terms of public relations. Obviously, Wamross Books, who have the books outside for sale later. Gary Miller and Peter North are videographers. And I want to give a special thanks to today's volunteers, Cy Ford, Nora Rossi, Judy Fix, Mickey Kennedy, Jean Savinello, Ann Doherty, and Donato Vaccaro. And again, special thanks to Concordia College and Ellen de St. Val, Director of Community Relations for the college, who has been largely responsible for the entire setup here and everything that follows afterward. So we're very grateful to her work. The rest of the program is going to be conducted by our 3 library directors. And so I want to welcome right now Tracy Wright, director of the Eastchester Public Library, who will sort of set the stage for our speaker and introduce our author. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy we have such a great crowd today, even though the weather isn't too good. But I think you're all in for a treat. I'm here to introduce Jane Ziegelman. But first, I want to talk a little bit about her book. I know there are many people in the audience who have already read 97 Orchard. I see people nodding their heads. But for those of you who haven't, I just want to tell you a little bit about the book. 97 Orchard is an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one tenement building in New York City. And that tenement building is on 97 Orchard Street. And the time period that Jane is writing about is a time when 97 Orchard Street was one of the most densely populated areas in New York City. There were over 2,000 people living within 1 square block of the city. And they were living in apartments that had no elevators, of course, no running water, no refrigerators. If you needed water, you went downstairs and brought it back up in a bucket. Not an easy way to live, and certainly not an easy way to cook. And mostly the book is about food. You'd see my eyes sparkling. Food, yes. But I'm not going to tell you too much about that. I do want to say that Jane dispels a couple of myths about ethnic foods and where they came from. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce the director of the Culinary Center of the Tenement Museum and author of 97 Orchard, Jane Ziegelman.
I have to do this every time I come to a podium. Just lower the microphone. Well, hello, people of Westchester, Eastchester, Bronxville, Tuckahoe. Did I leave? Okay. I'm really very happy to be here today. And I know that Eastchester has a very rich immigrant past. In preparation for today, I tried to learn a little bit about that past. And for that, I have to thank Dick Forliano, who gave me some great insight, showed me some of his wonderful articles, and really gave me a kind of overview of what has taken place here. So thank you for that, Dick. The bulk of the story that you're about to hear tonight is set on the Lower East Side and looks at the immigrants, many groups of immigrants, who settled there beginning in the mid-19th century. First, however, I'd like to say a few words about pre-immigrant New York. At the start of the 19th century, New York was in many ways an English city. It was culturally English. The overwhelming majority of New Yorkers were descended from the English. They belonged to an English church, and the local taverns served English ale. At dinner time, New Yorkers sat down to plates of roast beef and boiled mutton and steamed peas and minced pie, and among many other typical and classic English fare. By the end of the century, however, New York was a patchwork of diverse cuisines, the result of these successive waves of immigrants and the foods that traveled with them. Today, I'm going to talk about a couple of those foods, how they figured in immigrant life, and also how they were received by native-born New Yorkers. New York immigrant history really begins in the 1840s with the arrival of the Irish. This was a group made up primarily of young, unmarried men and women, many of them still in their teens. The Irish initially settled in a part of Lower Manhattan, a rather rough neighborhood that was once known as the Five Points, and today's Chinatown. Irish men entered the American economy as laborers, and Irish muscle power was responsible for building some of New York's most recognized landmarks, which includes Central Park and the Brooklyn Bridge. I know that here in Westchester, the Irish worked in the local quarries. and lived in Irish-run boarding houses. Irish women typically found work as domestics in middle-class households, one of the only jobs they could find at the time because of the tremendous anti-Irish bias. Now, the kinds of sources or research material that I used to write 97 Orchard fell into two broad camps. On one side were the accounts written by outside observers, people like government officials, social workers, journalists, among a much larger group of similar types. On the other side were accounts written by the immigrants themselves. And included in that second group is a collection of Irish immigrant letters from the mid-19th century, one of them by a young woman named Kathy, who is here in New York on her own, and it appears is living as a domestic. The letter was written to her mother back in Ireland, and I'd like you to hear just a little piece of it. So this is Kathy's letter. My dear Mama, what on earth is the matter with you all that none of you would think of writing to me? The fact is I'm heartsick fretting. I cannot sleep the night, and if I chance to sleep, I wake up with the most frightful dreams. I would do battle with the world and would never feel dissatisfied if I would hear often from you and know candidly how things are going. I trust you are well and that my frightful dreams won't be realized. Kathy. And then just to rub it in, there's a postscript, with love to one and all, and for God's sake, write soon, your lonely daughter, Kathy. Now, aside from the basic challenges of survival, immigrants faced a whole battle of more interior or emotional or psychological pressures. The loneliness that Kathy is writing about here was, in fact, a typical feature of immigrant life, but so were feelings of dislocation and disorientation and powerlessness and confusion. Not easy. This is where we get to the food. In essence, food was an antidote to the unique stresses of immigration. At the most elemental level, immigrants, just like everyone in this room, were imprinted with certain food expectations, ideas about how food was supposed to look and taste and smell, along with many other food beliefs. And when those expectations were met, they experienced that profound sense of well-being, of satisfaction, which I think we also all know. For the immigrant, however, the powers of food were magnified. By the time their ships reached America, immigrants were effectively, and in most cases, permanently severed from their homelands, from everything familiar to them, from everyone they loved. In the face of that loss, native foods connected them to towns and to families they would never see again. Memories and traditions were preserved in the form of food, and in that jarring process of starting over, food was a very precious source of continuity. With so much at stake, immigrants very quickly established networks of food laborers, food tradespeople, importers, merchants, restaurant keepers, and so on, to meet their highly specific culinary needs. Many of these culinary workers filled highly specialized roles. That included the German Krauthobler, a figure that appears in my book and who I discovered during my research. He was a tradesman who went door to door with a special instrument, what was it like? Kind of like a large grating machine that was used for shaving or slicing cabbage for homemade sauerkraut. The season for cabbage shaving was fall. But in spring, New Yorkers got their first glimpse of the Italian dandelion picker. This was a woman, generally an older woman, who walked through New York with a large sack over her shoulder, foraging in empty lots or by the side of roads or in city parks for wild salad greens. The most poignant to me of all these food specialists was a Russian Jew who spent his days bent over a hand crank horseradish grinder, literally reduced to tears by the fumes that were rising from the horseradish. And even after his workday was over, you could always pick this guy out of the crowd because his eyes were always so red and puffy. But the backbone of the immigrant food economy was the pushcart market. For immigrant homemakers, the pushcarts were America's answer to hunger. Pushcart peddlers, who were immigrants themselves, understood the homemaker's culinary needs and provided her with familiar foods at absolute rock bottom prices. And maybe just as important, they allowed her to buy food in the quantity she could afford, whether that meant a half a parsnip or a single egg or a handful of rice, just enough food to prepare for the next meal. And women did, in fact, shop meal by meal, using the pushcarts, in a sense, as an extension of their own kitchens. New Yorkers who toured the pushcart market were horrified by what they considered terribly unsanitary conditions and really shoddy merchandise. Stories in the city newspapers claimed that fruit on the pushcarts was either underripe or rotten, that the bread was moldy, the fish was tainted, and so on. Pushcart peddlers were regular targets of a special arm of the New York Police Department known as the Sanitary Police, and sanitary officers conducted surprise raids on the pushcarts in which the peddlers were essentially treated like gangsters. While no pushcart food was entirely above suspicion, some were worse than others. And a food of particular concern were pickles. New Yorkers denounced the open pickle barrels sitting out on the curb as receptacles of disease and flinched every time the pickle vendor plunged his arm in, sometimes up to the elbow to retrieve his pickle. But the pickle was problematic in its own right. An example of everything that was wrong with immigrant cooking. Pickles were too salty. They were too sour, they were too peppery, too garlicky. The exact opposite of the much blander foods that New Yorkers were accustomed to and which they believed constituted a wholesome diet. Without question, the epicenter of the pickle problem was the Jewish section of the Lower East Side, the streets east of the Bowery that had been settled in the 1880s. Unfortunately, groups living near the Jews discovered the pickles, developed a taste for them, and before too long, this problem was really epidemic. According to the experts, the real victims of the immigrant pickle habit were children. American health workers were appalled to learn that school kids spent their lunch money on pickles instead of more appropriate, less flavorful foods. The taste of the standard Jewish pickle was so aggressive that Americans wondered how anyone, and how children in particular with their innocent palates, could choose this food by choice. So instead, they saw pickle eating as a form of compulsion. More than a food, the pickle was a kind of drug for immigrant kids who were still too young for beer. And drug in this context was meant in an absolutely literal sense. If you look at nutritional textbooks from the period, you'll see that pickles are classified under the heading of stimulants, a category that also includes tea, coffee, and alcohol, all the way up to cocaine. As it turns out, the experts were not entirely wrong. Immigrant kids did have a special affection for pickles. The reason was both a matter of taste and of price. For 1 penny, a pickle delivered a burst of flavor, a wonderful counterpoint to all of the potatoes and the noodles and the bread which made up the bulk of their daily diet. And if you knew how to eat a pickle, that pickle could last for hours. There's a wonderful scene in the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, in which the heroine of the book, who happens to be a young Irish girl, her name is Francie, buys a pickle in the morning and really spends the rest of the day nursing that pickle, nibbling on it, licking it, until it was time for dinner. So it was a wonderful food investment. By the end of the 19th century, New Yorkers walking west from the Jewish East Side would have found themselves in the midst of a very quickly growing Italian community. The Italian migration began in the 1880s and reached its peak in 1907 when 285,000 Italian immigrants landed at Ellis Island. The overwhelming majority of them came from southern Italy and Sicily, where they worked as sharecroppers, or contadini in Italian. Living in small towns and villages with no land of their own, the contadini really did live at the margins of subsistence. Their survival depended on a single article, immense loaves of dark, crusty bread. Famines among the contadini were known as times without bread, while America was the land of bread and work. This was the contadini's definition of abundance. However, even the poorest of the contadini had access to the foods of affluence. Several times a year, on feast days like Easter and Christmas, and on the local saints' days, landowners would present their contadini with gifts of food, like poultry and meats and pasta and olive oil and cheese and wine. In America, these special holiday foods became really the building blocks of a new cuisine, and immigrant cooks took full advantage of them to create what we think of today as Italian-American cooking. Italians were drawn to America by the massive construction boom that took place just after the Civil War. With their families still in Italy, Italian men fanned out across the United States to work in railroad construction, to build dams, pave roads, and dig canals. Italian laborers built the city's first subway line. In Eastchester, they took the place of the Irish at the quarries, but as the community filled out, they also opened food-related businesses, restaurants and fish stores and bakeries and groceries, most of them concentrated in Tuckahoe along Main Street and Columbus Avenue. The main shopping street in New York's Little Italy was Mulberry Street, lined with groceries, butcher shops, bakeries, and all manner of other food stores, including Italian candy stores. Mulberry Street was also the scene of the neighborhood's busiest and best pushcart market. A defining feature of that market was the abundance and variety of fresh vegetables. Grown on Italian farms, both in New Jersey and on Long Island. They were known as truck farms because the merchandise was trucked in daily. Much of that produce, the vegetables in particular, were absolutely unknown to New Yorkers outside the Italian community. And that was particularly true of the largest vegetable family, the salad greens, the escaroles and the chicories and the arugulas and all the other many types of lettuces which Italians like to use for their salads. You have to understand that at this time, this is around 1900, the American idea of a salad was some kind of chopped protein, either chicken or maybe lobster or shrimp, mixed with mayonnaise and some chopped celery and served on a lettuce leaf. The Italian idea of a salad, just a plate of leaves, struck Italians as insubstantial. And in fact, Americans saw Italian cooking in general as an insubstantial cuisine. Too many vegetables, too much starch, too little meat. For the most part, immigrants traveled with very few possessions. One exception to that rule was kitchen implements. The exact nature of the implement was a question of geography. So for example, German women traveled to America with their spätzle or noodle presses. It's like a device that looks a little like a potato ricer. Women from Eastern Europe, if they were Jewish, crossed the Atlantic with special oblong pots, about this long, usually made of copper, which they used specifically for cooking the Sabbath gefilte fish. But if the woman were Italian, her tool of choice was her rolling pin, a heavy wooden cylinder up to 3 feet long, which she used for rolling pasta. In America, Italian women continued to make their own pasta, rolling it in the kitchen, cutting it with a knife, just as they used to back in the home country. But as immigrants moved up in the world, they turned to the dried, store-bought variety, which they considered a more high-status food. A little bit of a switch from today. The American pasta industry started in New York in pasta shops that doubled as very small-scale factories. Like many immigrant businesses, the whole operation, the entire factory, was tucked away within the tenements. The pasta was manufactured in the basement, sold from the street-level store, and behind the store, you'd have the family's living quarters. So it was all a very nice, cozy arrangement. One of the sights that routinely impressed visitors to Little Italy were the racks of fresh pasta produced by these shops and left to dry in open doorways and open windows, and even sometimes hanging from fire escapes. Just as a footnote, I should add that the Ronzoni company started in exactly this way as one of these tenement pasta shops. It started in Baxter Street toward the end of the 19th century. As devoted meat eaters, Americans were mystified that Italians could prefer a plate of spaghetti over a nice piece of beef. But the deeper mystery was a matter of mechanics. In their first encounter with spaghetti, American eaters were incapable of conveying the pasta all the way from the plate to their mouths. They tried the Italian twirling method, and when that failed, which it did, they resorted to cutting their pasta with a knife and fork. So that is how our ancestors ate their pasta. The challenges of pasta eating provided good material for journalists, particularly humorists. And parodies of these clumsy Americans wrestling with their pasta began to appear in the popular press. For American employers, however, pasta presented a really serious economic threat. As they saw it, laborers who subsisted on pasta, and remember that our labor force was heavily Italian at this time, were inadequately nourished and were therefore inferior workers. So nothing less than American productivity hung in the balance. Native-born citizens felt it was their job to wean the immigrants away from their native foods and teach them the virtues of American cooking. Of course, it was for their own good, but it was also for the larger good. In the first decades of the 20th century, as immigration rates continued to climb, Americans decided that culinary reform was the key to effective assimilation. And as a result, culinary instruction became a regular feature of the settlement houses in immigrant neighborhoods and of the local public schools. In classrooms across urban America, immigrant daughters learned how to poach eggs, how to boil oatmeal, and most importantly, how to make cream sauce. The hope here was that that educators could reach the parents by way of their kids who would smuggle the foods into the tenements. But the big payoff came 10 or 15 years down the road when these same girls were wives and mothers, and they would feed their kids on boiled carrots and creamed chicken. As they settled into their new lives in America, immigrants learned new domestic skills, new forms of work, and eventually a new language. Women folded up their kerchiefs. Men shaved their beards. On Sundays, immigrants took the elevated railroad to Coney Island, just like any other New Yorker. And on the 4th of July, they hung flags from the fire escape. They lit bonfires. They danced in the streets to celebrate their new home. And this very much was their home. When it came to mealtime, however, these same immigrants went to extraordinary lengths to preserve their native foods and food traditions. Repeated attempts to reform the immigrant cook were met with resistance. At the same time, however, and this is sort of the tricky part of the history, the subtlety in the history, America offered immigrants all kinds of new eating opportunities, and immigrant cooks very happily and enthusiastically embraced those possibilities. So immigrant cooking was not frozen in time. It did evolve. For me, one of the big surprises in this story was the level of attention which Americans devoted to immigrant food. Immigrant eating habits were the object of both intense scrutiny and passionate discussion for Americans from many walks of life, from nutritionists to politicians. I was also surprised that immigrant foods were the source of so much anxiety. Fortunately for all of us, food attitudes seem to have come full circle. The foreign foods that caused us so much distress are now mainstays of the American dinner table. We know how to twirl our pasta. We enjoy our salads. We're not afraid of garlic. Immigrants gave us their food, and if we're lucky, they also left us with some fraction of their ingenuity, their stamina, and their spunk. Thank you. So would you like me to stay up here? For questions? Yeah, yes, sure.
Hi, my name is Swadesh Pashtanda. I'm the director of Takahu Public Library. And what an excellent performance. And the question answer, so yeah, it's wonderful, wonderful. And one thing from your talk, I find out it doesn't matter if women came in 1920s or 1987 when I came. I also bring some, brought some parts, which I wanted to use. I used it in India and I wanted to use it here. So I think we are all the same.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we have now, it's my pleasure also that Ms. Jane is going to entertain some questions. And we have Mr. Donato Vaccaro and Linda Laird will be here with the microphone. So please, if you have any question, please give your name and Ms. Jane will be.
I'll try to answer.
Yes.
It's Don Blauweiss. And I was just saying that my parents grew up in that neighborhood, lived and got married around the corner on Stanton Street. Last week I had dinner with my son and my wife at 85 Orchard Street, which is now part of the new transformation of that neighborhood. One of the things I was wondering about in terms of 97 Orchard Street, which, of course, the title of your book, is my expectation was that I've known, and I think most of us know that neighborhood as the Lower East Side as being an enclave of Jewish immigrants. And my understanding was that you were going to be talking about the families of 97. Is that, or is the answer to that read the book?
Well, even if you read the book, you would see that the families provide a kind of scaffolding to tell the story. But in a way, they're not the stars of the narrative. They're a jumping off point to sort of enter the larger city and talk about what's going on in the world of food in a much broader way, and then we come back to the family, and then we leave again. So it's not really a family history.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Edward Powers, and just to comment, you're right in that Al Smith came right out of that neighborhood that you're describing. I'm over here. And my question had to do with something that you mentioned.
I don't have my glasses on, so I can.
Oh, I'm here. Okay. Hi. My question had to do with something that you mentioned, which was the Sanitary Commission. Okay. And you mentioned that that was really a arm of the police department. And two things. It's interesting, last year, I'm not plugging the book, but Mary Beth King came out with a book called Fever, and it had to do with Typhoid Mary. And she was an Irish immigrant, and she was captured by the Sanitary Commission and spent 26 years imprisoned on North Brother Island, which is next to Rikers Island. So the conditions in terms of health in that time were a big challenge. And I'll finish up by saying, yes, thank you for bringing to light that that area consisted of a large wave of Eastern European, Russian, mainly Jewish immigrants. And they were able to form their own health centers and their own nursing homes, mainly from Lvov, which is now under siege in the Ukraine. And so my question really has to do with, were you able to touch on any of the health issues in that area, mainly with tuberculosis, okay, or typhoid, and how that impacted on the family? And were any of the hospitals that were down in that area, such as Gouverneur or what was St. Vincent's or New York Hospital, did these immigrant families have any access to those health facilities? Thank you.
Thank you. I was aware of a kind of health system emerging on the Lower East Side. The sort of health figures that I was most interested in, because they went into the tenements themselves, were the visiting nurses that came from the settlement houses. And they came not only to deliver medical treatment, but sort of as educators, to teach women ways to be more sanitary in their homes. Some of what they taught was really based on American biases of the time, but not all of it. And they served a very important function within the tenements. I also know about the medical repository. There were free clinics set up throughout the Lower East Side. I don't remember how they were referred to. And you could, if you were sick, you could receive treatment. I guess I'm not really answering your question exactly, but yet the bottom line is there was tremendous problems with tuberculosis, particularly because of the sweatshops and all of the sort of fluff that rose from the fabric as you were cutting and sewing, and all of this was inhaled. One of the characters in the book dies of tuberculosis. So I know it was a tremendous challenge.
We have a question up here. On a more humorous kind of a note, I'm Heidi, and I was watching these two young gentlemen here laugh enjoyably as you talked about how Americans were appalled about the spaghetti and how we couldn't eat it. My question is, we have so many different kinds of noodles and pastas. Was that something that the Italians chose to make, to reinvent and create these different shapes that we could eat easily?
Well, no, is the short answer. Just a little mini history on pasta. There was pasta in New York and in America before the Italians, but it came via the French, who called it macaroni, and that was the generic term for what we call pasta today. And macaroni weren't the long, skinny noodles. They were more like little stubby elbow-shaped noodles. And people did eat dishes like macaroni and cheese and there were other casserole-type dishes. What was really new were these long, slippery noodles. That was the sort of, that's when the challenge came. And the other little shapes are authentically Italian shapes, but they are, as you say, easier to eat.
Here.
Hello.
You make an interesting point between food and immigrant identity. You know, the idea that food was a way in which immigrants sort of maintained and solidified their identity. Could you say more about that? And also, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are as to what's happening today. You know, we eat Mexican food, Chinese food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Does that sort of refer to our diffusement of our identity now than what it was, you know, in the times that you're talking about?
Well, I think it does speak to a certain kind of cosmopolitanism of which we are proud, and we claim that as New Yorkers. So it's not an accident that we're eating that way. We're saying something about ourselves and our food choices, just as the immigrants were saying something about themselves and their food choices. And I know in this talk, I talk a lot about preservation and continuity. And there was a lot of preservation and continuity, but it was going on in a very interesting way. It was change and continuity taking place at the same time. One thing that immigrants really resisted were outsiders telling them how to cook. There were many cooking classes in the settlement houses, and particularly the Italians would not attend those classes. That was no way. There was free food served in New York school lunchrooms beginning in 1919. Italian children were told to come home and have good food, not the lunches. However, at the same time, and there was tremendous pride in the national cuisine. At the same time, America offered this opportunity to eat meat. And this was a change that the Italians were happy to make. So they incorporated meat in a much more significant way into their daily diets. And in some ways, gave it the gloss of tradition, even though it was something new. Does that, yeah.
Okay, we're going to come down to you.
Hi, my name's Kevin McArdle. I was just reading that Colorado has legalized pickles. I don't know if you knew that. But my question is, the genesis of your book, was it from a culinary side or was it from a historical side that you came up with the idea for the book?
Well, the true story of that is that while I was in grad school, I was working as an intern at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And my job was to go around speaking to old people, very old people. These are people that had actually lived in the tenement, and the tenement was last closed in 1935, so people who had lived in the building pre-1935, collecting oral histories, capturing their memories. And their stories are amazing. I love these people. They were just very inspiring people. And I sort of got hooked through them, and eventually she was then the president of the museum, said, Jane, write a book. She knew that I had a lot of interest in food, so it was a combination of that internship and then a voice from the outside just giving me the push.
Hi. I'm an immigrant myself, so I have a question, obviously. I have half Italian and French in me and been here 40-something years in this country. Was the Indian didn't have an impact on the Americans, early Americans who came into this country and were starting to bring whatever England they knew about their food or whatever the Dutch and the German and whatever, and or all other countries, but the Indians were here for thousands of years before, whatever it is. So then when the immigrants who came perhaps were trying to learn also from the Indians what they were eating. I know the Hudson River had oyster beds everywhere. So I'm a little curious about, we're talking about Italian, French, Dutch, and whatever it is, but why are we forgetting about what the Indians were, they were here before any of us came here?
Yeah, there absolutely were Native American influences in New York food, and there were absolutely Dutch influences in New York food too. It's just that that's not my period, so I don't know enough about it to be really authoritative. I mean, I can say that one of the most popular street foods in New York was just boiled corn. There were women known as they were boiled corn peddlers, and they would walk through the street, with a pot balanced on their heads, and they would sing. Apparently, their singing was supposed to be very beautiful, and it was only at night. They just came out at night. So, just an example of one Native American food that became a very important, cultural food in New York.
Hi, I'm Wesley, and that's too close. I was just reading a book, Behind the Kitchen Doors, and I was wondering, did any of the immigrants work in restaurants? And if they did, how were the working conditions?
Many immigrants worked in restaurants. Many immigrants started restaurants for people like themselves. So Russians started restaurants for Russians, Hungarians for Hungarians, and so on and so on. The Irish were highly involved in the restaurant business, not so much as Irish chefs, but they were for a long time the wait staff in New York restaurants. I'm trying to think about the conditions in the restaurants, what I know about that. These were mostly, the restaurants that I know about were really small family places, and a lot of them were actually run out of people's tenement apartments. So the front parlor might be a restaurant. And as I remember it, they didn't work under terrible conditions.
Hi, Jane. My name is Tina Molinari, and I was just wondering, when you were talking about the Italians' resistance to eating the American foods and the meat, wasn't money an obstacle with regard to eating meat, or was that not an issue?
It was an obstacle at first when they had the worst jobs in the city, the hauling garbage jobs, and paving streets, which were the lowest paying form of employment you could have. But as they moved up, meat became economically feasible. And what they discovered is that food in America was incredibly cheap. You could buy food on a laborer's salary, and they took full advantage of that. Just one point, just on this idea of identity and food and meat and so on. There were also, in some cases, foods that immigrants very purposefully rejected because it told a story about them which they didn't want. They wanted to kind of push to the side. So, for instance, and this is in the case of the Italians, they stopped eating the really coarse, heavy grain breads, which was a bread they associated with poverty, and started eating the bread made from white flour, which was the bread of the aristocracy.
We actually have time for just 2 more questions. We're going to have a question here, and then our town historian, Dick Forliano, has the last question.
Hi, I'm Marion Dreyfus, and I work on Baxter and Hester Street right now, and the place I work in is a converted loft or something from that time that you speak of, and it's a wonderful place to work because I lived in China for some time, and Baxter and Hester is in the thick of Chinatown now, and I'm interested in the fact that when I lived in China, which I did for some years, the conditions in the small, little, tiny places which we used to eat in called the dirty alley were appalling, the sanitary conditions, but I never got sick. And in Baxter and Hester Street, when I buy food at lunch, the conditions are equally not so fabulous. But we don't get sick, and I'm one of the few Caucasians who buy food there, but the Chinese come and flock there. I'm wondering if you know, if in the time that you're speaking about the sanitary police against particularly the Jewish peddlers, that reflected a general overall anti-Semitic, we don't like them as immigrants, which was felt among the Irish and the Italians as well, rather than just the pickles being a problem.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Despite all of these raids and the sanitary police and the arrests, there was a systematic survey done of the pushcarts by the mayor of New York in 1905, where they decided, they call it a pushcart census, where they went pushcart to pushcart, evaluating the quality of the goods, evaluating the service of the peddler, and other sort of similar standards, and they found that the food was perfectly wholesome, that you were getting great value for the dollar, and that there was really the pushcarts really did not pose a sanitary threat. I don't know if it was anti-Semitism in particular, but it certainly had to do with foreigners, and it also had to do with a certain way of using the street. Nobody else in New York sold food from the street. It was sort of dirtying up or confusing the streets, or it was inappropriate. Street foods should be sold in indoor markets. So that was another problem. And in fact, there were strong protests against the pushcart market on those grounds as well.
For the last question, a question that has troubled aficionados of food for years and years and years. I hope you can settle it.
Oh, no.
Did pizza come from Italy to America, or did it go from America back to Italy? Which?
Pizza absolutely came from Italy
to
America. It came from Naples, and there were, in the early part of the 20th century, there were already pizza makers here. I tried to find the earliest references to pizza, and they're about 1903. And I think that there was back and forth between the two countries in the sense that our pizza did come to influence their pizza, and now we're looking back toward Italy again and redoing our pizza. So there's this kind of transatlantic pizza conversation taking place. But it's real Italian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jane, and also all the participants for answering the question. I just one more point. I want to thank Betty Donwan, because she thanked everybody, but she's the one who is behind all of this. And please give her a round of applause. Gabriella Radzuko, who is the director of Bronxville Public Library.
Good afternoon. My name is Gabriella Radzuko. I'm the director of the Bronxville Public Library. I want to thank Jane so much for kicking off the Eastchester 350 celebration. Today I'm experiencing a renewed sense of pride in having perfected my gnocchi recipe. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the audience for being here. It really encourages us, everyone involved in the project, and gives us courage to develop programming for the Eastchester 350 celebration. For the last 14 months, our 3 libraries have been working on a number of projects. We've been busy encouraging book clubs and the public to read 97 Orchard. We've been developing a children's reading list organized around themes of family legacies, neighborhoods, and community. And we've created a database of local authors from Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. So if you're an author, please see me. We're also working with various friends organizations to develop various programs related to our common immigrant legacies and the influence of ethnic cuisines. I'm going to give you a short list of some of the library events that are been planned. There are more in the planning stages. And of course, you can learn more about those details by visiting our respective websites. So there's a film series coming up on immigrants in America on Monday afternoons in March and April at the Eastchester Public Library. There'll be a future cooking class by Jane Ziegelman, also to be held at the Eastchester Public Library. In Bronxville, we're hosting The American Dream, a lecture by music historian Robert Cohen, which will explore the multiple meanings of this phrase through folk and popular song from colonial times to the present. And the Friends will be hosting Poetry and Legacy, where there will be readings of poems about the immigrant experience, featuring Bronxville residents and other professionals reading poems from their countries of origin. There'll also be the 6th annual poetry contest sponsored by the Friends with submissions of original work by students. And again, check out our websites and you'll get more detailed information. Other programs that are being developed at the local level include 2 restaurant weeks, one in April, one in May, sponsored by the Eastchester and Tuckahoe Chamber of Commerce. So that's quite a lot of work done already, and it's getting real. Please keep the brochure that you received today so that you can follow the events throughout the year on the website. That's eastchester350.org. And please leave the form that accompanied the brochure with a volunteer at the door. To indicate your interest in learning more about a first ever hardcover history of Eastchester, which is being written and edited at this time, and the publication is slated for the fall. Again, thank you, Concordia College and Ellen de Saint Phal for your hospitality. And the committee encourages all of you to stay for a visit, to purchase Jane's book, to have her autograph it for you. And also we have some tasty refreshments inspired by her book, one of which, the cranberry strudel recipe, is actually featured in that book. And if you're interested in gnocchi and have any suggestions for me, please see me later. Thank you. It was a pleasure being part of this great presentation.